In this video, we're going to start one of my favorite stories of all of history, and that is the conflicts leading to the Revolution. We're going to start with Bacon's Rebellion, even though it's not really part of the Revolution, but it is a conflict that leads to it, and that's what the notes are on. Okay, Nathaniel Bacon is a farmer who has a problem with the Native Americans who keep coming onto his property and messing up his farm. And he appeals to the government in Virginia asking for help, and he doesn't really get any help. In fact, the governor, which is Berkeley at the time, kind of ignores him, and Berkeley, Bacon knows, is good friends with the king. So after several appeals and saying, if you don't do something, I will, and being ignored by the government, Bacon takes matters into his own hands and leads a group of farmers against the government for not supporting them against the Native Americans. And what they do is essentially burn down Berkeley's house and most of Jamestown, Virginia. So I want you to remember that Bacon burns, okay? Bacon burns down most of Jamestown because he's upset because they're not supporting him against the Native Americans. And this is a good indication of the tensions between the English colonists and the Native Americans during this time period. Okay, this also is another example of the tension, the French and Indian War. This is part of the 7 Years' War that's happening all across the world at this time, where the European countries are battling out for the most power and most control. And in this particular part of the war, the French and the Indians are fighting the British and the colonists. Okay, so I want you to know that the French and Indian War is not the French versus the Indians. It's the French and the Indians versus the British and the colonists. Just like when we called the Iraq War, that's against Iraq. The Vietnam War is us versus Vietnam. The Korean War, us versus Korea. French and Indian War, us versus French and Indians. Us, at the time, just happens to be the colonists and the British. Okay, they're fighting over this trade barrier right here, okay? So you see here where we have the stripes. We've got the French colonies here and then the British colonies here, and both of them claim this trade route, okay? So this is what they're fighting about in this particular area, okay? So France and Britain fight for control over the colonies and trade routes. Britain is going to win this war, however, it's very, very expensive. 7 years all the way across the ocean. In fact, this is a little longer than 7 years in the making. And the king is going to have to pay for this somehow. And he's not very happy about it. And he also, if you remember, finds out a lot of the things that the colonists are doing that he was unaware of. If you remember Salutarian Neglect, remember the king is ignoring the colonists. He's kind of doing things or dealing with affairs that are happening in Europe at the time and his own personal affairs. And so we have this thing called the Navigation Acts, which said that all ships in the colonies had to stop in British harbors first. Because remember, with mercantilism, the colonies had to first trade with their mother country. They produced raw materials for the mother country so the mother country could make money. So the problem with this is the colonists are not sending the raw materials to their mother country. In fact, they're trading with other European countries and other European colonies, which is good for the colonies because they're making money. Not so good for England and not so good for the king. So I want you to make a note that this Navigation Act is a law that is enforcing the idea of mercantilism. Let me say that again. The Navigation Acts are laws that enforce the idea of mercantilism. Okay? But the problem with this is that it's being ignored, the law is, by the colonists, because the king's not enforcing it because he's not paying attention to them. And that's called salutary neglect. Okay? If you note, this is 1660, but the war is happening way after this. So why did I put this on the timeline after the war? And the reason for that is because, if you remember, the French and Indian War ends salutary neglect. So these laws are largely ignored. The king is not enforcing them until the French and Indian War, when he finds out what in the world are these colonies doing. After he sends troops over and he's put all this money in, he suddenly starts to take notice that they are not actually trading all they're supposed to with their mother country, with him. Okay, so make a note that this is before the French and Indian War. It's just not enforced. The Navigation Acts are not enforced until afterwards, when the period of salutary neglect ends. So the king starts taking notice, and then he starts enforcing laws that have been in place for a while. The war ends with the Treaty of Paris, and in the Treaty of Paris, part of it is the Proclamation Line of 1763. And this said that there will be no settlement past this line, and this purpose is to ease the conflict with the Native Americans. Now get out your maps with the colonies on them, the one that looks like this, that you color-coded, the regions, and draw. This green line right here, this is the Proclamation Line. The idea is that the colonists should not move west. They should not settle west of this line so that the Native Americans won't get any more upset with the colonies. Because it's not like once the war is over, the Native Americans disappear. They're still there. And the king does not want to have another war or any other trouble with the Native Americans. And so they draw this line saying, don't go past it. Okay, which is a great idea in theory, except think about it. If you're living in the colonies at this time, there's not a line in your yard outside your door. It's not like there's a line saying don't go past it. It's not a fence. There's no burn mark in the grass saying don't go past this. And so the colonists do. They start settling past it. I mean, one, who's going to know? Two, there's no line in the ground to tell them not to. Plus, they've been breaking the rules all this whole time anyways because the king's been ignoring them, so they're not really used to having laws enforced on them. So they'd say, oh, this is another law, we're just going to ignore it and do what we want to do, and they think that's going to be okay. Alright, then comes the Sugar Act of 1764. Like I said, the French and Indian War along with the 7 Years' War is super, super expensive, and the king and Parliament had to figure out a way to pay for it. So the Sugar Act is a tax on sugar. Also on textiles, wine, coffee, indigo. Indigo is a dye, by the way. It's like a blue color. So mainly on sugar. And this is the first tax to raise money and not regulate trade. They've had taxes before, but usually it's just to regulate trade. This is the first tax that they just put on something so they can raise money. And it's not just something they put it on. It's sugar. And let's think about, what do the colonists drink during this time period? It's not like they have Coke or Pepsi, Kool-Aid, none of that. They have water, which is dirty, because they don't have, chlorine, and they haven't figured out how to sanitize their water yet. So the options are tea, coffee, and beer, pretty much. And two of those things, if you want to make them taste good, you need to put sugar in them. Coffee and tea, you're going to put sugar in. So the fact that they're taxing something that the colonists use so frequently, this is going to be a problem. Alright. Oh, by the way, in fact, the colonists are pretty upset about this, so a lot of people are selling this on the black market, okay? In fact, Patrick Henry gets his wealth from selling sugar on the black market. He gets super rich from selling and smuggling sugar into the colonies and selling it to the colonists without taxes. Alright. Then the king has to figure out, what am I going to do with all these troops that I've sent across the ocean that help fight this war? Well, maybe I'll just keep them there so I can get them to help me enforce the law that the colonists have not been paying attention to. So the troops are forced to stay in the homes of the colonists, and the colonists have to pay for them. The colonists do not want them there. The colonists are ready for them to go home. They have overstayed their welcome. They're ready to send them back. The colonists certainly do not want to pay for them. And it's not like the troops are super nice. They're ready to go home too, and they aren't easy to deal with. So this is called the Quartering Act, okay? I'm sure you've heard at the pirate football games, they say no quarter, no quarter. Quarter means housing, okay? We don't want the opposing team to stay, so we say no quarter. We're going to push them off the plank, so to speak. They're not allowed to stay on the ship. That's where we get that term. So quartering means staying. Alright, moving on. Then there's a tax on the Stamp Act. This is on all documents or paper goods, such as newspapers, playing cards, letters, of course. And this is a tax only on the colonies, okay? It's called a direct tax, because the English citizens in Great Britain aren't going to have to pay this tax. Only the colonists are. And the colonists are not okay with this. They're like, if we're English citizens, then everyone should be taxed, not just us. And so they boycott the Stamp Act. And if you think about this, what do colonists do in 1760s for fun? Well, they write letters to their cousins, and they play cards, and they read the paper, and they read books. It's not like they're playing, Wii or Xbox or, texting their friends. They're writing letters. There's nothing really to do during this time. Okay, so 1, you got a tax on your sugar, which is the only thing that makes your drink good. 2, now you've got to pay a tax on things you do for fun, pretty much, and the colonists aren't okay with that. In fact, the Sons of Liberty is a gang, so to speak, that emerges from this. It's led by Samuel Adams. I'm sure you heard of him, at least not. You've heard of the beer, and there's a reason for that. He's quite a drinker, and he makes a lot of money off of some beer. But anyways, he leads this group called the Sons of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty are, in essence, a gang of rebels against the British. And basically what they do is they get together and they tar and feather stamp collectors. So if they see a stamp collector, they would basically throw hot tar, if you've ever smelled like someone paving the road or the interstate, okay, you know what hot tar smells like. They throw hot tar on stamp collectors and then a bucket of feathers. So 1, not only are you humiliated because you have feathers stuck to you, you're also injured and hurt, and a lot of times stamp collectors died. And the reason for that is the only way to get the tar off is to let it dry and peel it off. And oftentimes, to get it off, your skin comes off too. So it's pretty brutal and pretty gross, and not to mention you have feathers on you. So once this happens a couple times, other stamp collectors see the Sons of Liberty, and they hightail it out of there. They are not about to get tarred and feathered. And this is so successful, in fact, this boycott is, that not a single stamp is actually ever sold in the colonies. Okay, so the king still needs some money, because he's obviously not raising money this way, so he's going to have to do some other thing. So the Townshend Act, 1767. Now, instead of putting a tax on just paper, now it's a tax on paper, glass, paint, and tea. These are all luxury goods, by the way, glass and paint. Okay, if you were very wealthy back in the day, then you would paint your house. Oftentimes, you just paint the front of your house, and then leave the back and the sides the same, because paint was so expensive. Glass is a huge process to make glass. It's not something that's easily manufactured. In fact, they had to take glass and they put it into a hot furnace and they blow it and they twist it and they make it by hand. So these things are luxury goods. So now, not only are their paper goods taxed, which are pretty much the things they do for fun, but their tea is taxed, along with their sugar. And the colonists aren't very happy about this either, and they start this phrase called no taxation without representation. If we are not going to be represented in the Parliament in England, then you should not tax us. Okay, and this phrase sticks around for a while. Then we have what's called the Boston Massacre, and this is not a tax. This is a huge event that, with a lot of propaganda, is exposing some of the hatred that the colonists are starting to develop for the English. This happens in 1770, obviously in Boston, and the British troops shoot and kill 5 colonists during a street mob. Or that's at least what the colonists want you to think. Let's look at Paul Revere's drawing. So this is out of the Boston paper, and we've got his engraving of what his depiction of the event. Okay, if you look at this, he's a little deceiving with his little moon, but it looks like daytime. We've got the British troops lined up shoulder to shoulder, firing. We got their commander in the back saying, "Shoot, go, fire now." And we have all these innocent colonists, unarmed, in their, Sunday overcoats and in their trousers and their little top hats, being shot at and gruesomely bleeding to death. It's terrible. Okay? This is what Paul Revere, one of the Sons of Liberty, would like for you to imagine. Okay? Let me tell you what really happened. What really happened was, it's in the middle of the night, and it has been snowing in Boston, and pretty much everybody, the town is shut down, except people are going to the bars, and in this pub, it's closing time, so colonists leave, and then they come out and they see some troops across the street, and when you're drunk, you do stupid things, and these colonists are drunk, and so they do stupid things, like start picking a fight with the British troops. First a couple of sticks are thrown, then a couple of snowballs are thrown, and before you know it, you got the troops all up in the colonist's face saying you need to calm down, you need to go home, you're drunk, you're making bad decisions, and if you ever told a drunk they're making bad decisions, you know how the outcome of that goes. It's not so good. And they're like, "What do you mean? You trying to tell me what to do?" And then they get up all in their face, and of course when, a fight's about to happen, everybody and their brother's going to run out in the street or the hall, if we're at school, to see what's going on, and then we have a riot in the street. And then these troops, who are way overwhelmed by the number of colonists that are drunk coming out of the pubs, have to open fire, and when they do, they kill 5 people. Okay, why wouldn't the colonists just tell the real story? Well, because they're trying to have propaganda to change the mind of the colonists, to get them to start turning against the British so that they could eventually declare independence.